Final Fantasy, as a series, has been kicking for a lot longer than a number of us have been around. From its humble beginnings on the Nintendo Entertainment System back in July 12, 1990, to Final Fantasy XV's release on November 29th of 2016. This long-running role-playing game franchise has become a household name for gamers far and wide. It has become such a worldwide phenomenon that Final Fantasy has seen many spin-offs, sequels, anime adaptations, and even full feature-length movies. It's hard to deny that with so many great entries in the series, the simple role-playing game has had quite an impact on both the video game industry and the gaming culture surrounding it. So much so that I want to replay each and every one of them to see how well the game holds up today, and what impact it had back when it first released. I'll be going through every numbered entry from Final Fantasy I to Final Fantasy XV. I hope you'll join me as I undertake this massive retrospective series on the franchise that I dearly love. The best place to start on a retrospective this huge is none other than at the very beginning. Series creator and visionary Hironobu Sakaguchi was working part-time at Square and had a few mediocre releases under his belt. Sakaguchi wanted to create a role-playing game with the intent of making it a grand adventure, but the big chiefs at Square were a bit hesitant. It wasn't until another role-playing game series, Dragon Quest, was getting widespread success that Sakaguchi was given the green light. Without a shadow of a doubt, the final product was in fact Final Fantasy. You could say it was Sakaguchi's last-ditch effort at making a video game, or he was going to quit the industry entirely. Suffice to say, it wasn't anywhere close to being the last Final Fantasy. Now, before getting too deep into this retrospective, it is worth noting all the different releases and the higher definition re-releases. This would be a good time to talk about the version differences between its original release up to its recent port on Android and iOS phones. Aside from visual touch-ups, there is actually a lot of gameplay changes that's definitely worth noting. While the original release of Final Fantasy did come out on the Famicom back on 1987 for Japan, and for North Americans in 1990, it was considered a very difficult role-playing game for its time, requiring lots of grinding to earn money and levels to withstand punishment from tougher areas. There's not much going on visually, and it's very slow-paced. For players who have been spoiled by games made on newer generation hardware, it can feel very boring to watch, let alone play. Briefly going over its port list, Final Fantasy has been experienced on popular consoles like the NES, the PlayStation, the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo Wii Virtual Console, and PlayStation Portable, and on some lesser acknowledged platforms like the MSX2 and WonderSwan Color. Of course, it has a mobile phone port on Android and iOS. But since it's really damn expensive on the Play Store, and was clearly made for ants, we'll pass on that hot trash for now. The Game Boy Advance version and onward introduced the Bestiary and the bonus dungeon feature. It's randomized in terms of floor layout and rewards, but Odin help me if I can explain it in a coherent manner, and not waste a weekend. So in short, more things to do. If you wanted something closer to the original Nintendo release, the PlayStation 1 version of Final Fantasy Origins finds a nice middle ground on keeping the game tough, but fair. It retains the spell use per day, and the only way to save your game is using an IM. As for leveling, well, I hope you guys enjoy a good grind. Any seasoned Final Fantasy players will tell you that this version is the perfect one. And for the most part, they're right. However, the PlayStation Portable version has the best looking sprite work, remixed music, and overall presentation. Hands down is the best looking version, even though it is very easy in terms of difficulty. As for gameplay, versions of Final Fantasy after the PlayStation 1 era had the spell cost halved and converted the spell uses per day into just mana points counter, which the rest of the series continued to use. So, for the sake of this review, given that I'll be the one playing and you'll be the one to watch, you'll be seeing the PlayStation Portable version of Final Fantasy, because it looks so damn nice. Upon release, the very first Final Fantasy was without a doubt a simple quest to summarize. Save the princess from a bad guy, find out that you are the Warriors of Light, and set out to the world to retrieve the crystals. It's worth bringing up how Final Fantasy gave players the freedom of choice to create their own party. This in its own right gave the game a lot more replayability than most people would see at face value. A good rounded party is the default fighter, thief, white mage, and black mage. However, the freedom of choice here is what really gives it more value. To quickly sum up, the fighters are your basic tank and spank. Thieves have high speed for first hits and better chances of escaping. White mages and black mages are self-explanatory. Black belts excel at single target damage with no equipment. And the red mage is the jack of all trades, but a master of none. Interestingly enough, there's nothing to stop you from choosing the same class 4 times over either. I used to have a friend who used to find it fun to replay the NES version of Final Fantasy I and have self-imposed challenge runs. So he would try doing 4 fighters or 4 white mage runs to mix it up. By the way, did you know that having beefy classes at the top actually serves a purpose? Apparently, characters at the top of the party will have a higher chances to take punishment than having them sit at the bottom with the lowest chances of getting attacked. Now you know! The game drops you immediately into the world of Final Fantasy, with nothing to go on except your own sense of exploration and intuition. Most players will fight a couple of random battles, but the smart thing to do is hit up town and gear up. And at this point, I would like to discuss one of the game's biggest positives, the music. Series composer and musical big boy, Nobuo Uematsu, definitely hit the mark when creating the soundtrack. Sure, on the NES it had its limitations for what kind of chiptunes you could make, but as time went on, it's long since been remastered and a cornerstone of the franchise. In the PlayStation Portable version of Final Fantasy, the town's soundtrack has to be one of the comfiest tunes in all of Final Fantasy, let alone just for this entry. The guitar notes fit perfectly for remastering what made the NES and Famicom tunes so memorable. Just about every track in this game is fitting. Dungeons give off a vibe of exploration. The overworld is cheerful with a hint of good times. And the boss fights feel like the pressure is on and the tough guy can really mess up your day. Arguably, Final Fantasy I has one of the best soundtracks in the entire series. It really sets a high bar for the franchise. As the player goes from town to town, they'll have the option to upgrade their gear and choose spells. The majority of spell shops will have 4 spells per spell level, but a single caster can only have 3 per level, so they'll have to choose wisely. Of course, this means 3 white magic spells taken by the white mage, and vice versa with the black mage. But the red mage can mix and match between white and black spells. However, when it comes to the late game, the red mages can't dabble in the high level spells. As time goes on, the player will be going from area to area, help a town with its issues, and get a key item to proceed to the next area. Like, really early on, they'll save a town from pirates and be rewarded with a ship, thus opening up new areas to explore. After some grinding, you'll be spelunking in caves for a crown. Give a dwarf some TNT to open up a new place, and eventually reach your first elemental fiend boss. This boss, the Lich, is the game's first real challenge. Up until now, you've had some bosses sprinkled here and there, but most of them go down fairly quickly without hurting your team too much. Yeah, he starts off hitting your entire party with a heavy magic damage and a single target attack for huge hits. This is the perfect moment to have the player think, oh crap, I gotta use the rest of the party to substitute as secondary healers for a few turns. Since this is relatively early in the game, the white mages won't have access to the shell to help mitigate spell damage, so you got no choice but to eat it. Thankfully, if you've picked up the buff spells, Temper and Haste, this Lich goes down fairly quickly. Although there's only 4 to deal with throughout the entire game, these boys are the tough guys. As long as the player takes care to gear up and buy spells accordingly, they shouldn't have too much trouble. As the game progresses, they'll reach new continents, get a canoe to traverse rivers on mainlands, get key items to reach the remaining elemental fiend temples. Each have their own trials and treasure along the way. As a side note, it's definitely worth the while to fully explore the dungeons for loot. For the modern gamer going back to play this, it will be very daunting with all the lack of hand-holding in its world exploration. But in reality, it's really not just blundering around and hoping you'll stumble upon a place. If the players talk to the NPCs and pay attention to what they say, they'll be told where to go or where they should be heading. Most newer games will have some variation of an objective marker or a to-do list for story progression. What makes Final Fantasy so good in this adventurous aspect, it relies on the player to keep track of what's going on and which NPC needs help to keep the ball rolling. Since this was originally an NES and a Famicom game to begin with, Final Fantasy is a short game. If you know where you're going, you can beat it under 8 hours. Around the mid to late section, or depending on how you progress through the game, you'll eventually reach the Rat Tail and bring it to Bahamut. At this point, you'll discover the bread and butter of most replayed playthroughs for this game, the advanced jobs. Along with getting a new sprite of your dudes, the core reason why you want to get to this as fast as possible is because the stat gain. Up until now, the level ups have been pretty random and minuscule. However, with the advanced jobs, the gains are almost doubled. My girlfriend, who played Final Fantasy I for the first time without a walkthrough, reached the job advance around level 35, while I was level 24 when I met Bahamut. And the difference is quite staggering. By the end of the game, I was level 43, and she was level 55, and our character stats were almost exactly the same. Aside from the stat gains, with the job advancements of physical classes hit harder and have access to stronger weapons. Magic casters get to use the Mondo Man spells, and the Red Mages continue being the jack of all trades but the masters of none, being the rounded classes but without getting any of the top tier toys. I guess in this regard, having 4 Red Mage playthrough would be interesting. The early to mid game would be a breeze, but it would be a struggle with the late game and the super bosses. After clearing the last dungeons to obtain the rest of the elemental crystals, you'll have to return to where it all began to enter, the final dungeon. Of course, no role-playing game would be complete without recycling past bosses, but souped up, as a challenge before the end goal. The trash battles the players need to pass through is initially pretty tough, so stocking up on 99 of everything is almost a prerequisite at this point. As you reach the end goal, you'll find the final challenge waiting for you at the very end, and that's where the rest of the story comes in. Chaos. This guy was one mean son of a bitch if you didn't overlevel your party. Attacking twice a turn doesn't seem awful at first, but the majority of his moveset hits everyone in the party for big numbers. On more than a few times, I almost wiped to Chaos. Even with Protect and Shell, his attacks just keep punishing you. His physical single target hits like a freight train, and his party of wide spells are really devastating. As for the context of this, Narland has been 2,000 years in the past, causing problems for everyone in the future, with his ambition for supreme power. However, he does explain how it's been stuck in a time loop to keep this final battle going forever, until someone defeats his vicious cycle. Now, back on an NES game, this was a novel little plot device. I doubt many games would dabble on this time travel shenanigans, and it's pretty cool. You could say it's quite fitting to be the final boss for the Final Fantasy. With the final boss taken care of and the credits start to roll, you can't help but reflect on the adventure. Final Fantasy is definitely about the journey and not the destination. In retrospect, this was one of the comfiest Final Fantasies that I've ever played. The music is incredibly well composed. The art by the legend, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was spot on. More often than not, I catch myself sitting in town just humming along to the town's comfy music track. It's been a fantastic beginning for the franchise. The freedom of choice is this game's strong suit. In some regard, it does lift some ideas from Dungeons & Dragons, like having to rest at an inn to replenish your spells and save your progress. Being honest, I did note quite a few things that I didn't like, such as some spells you can purchase being completely useless, some legendary equipment being lackluster compared to shop items, and how healing magic takes a backseat once you have hundreds of potions sitting in your inventory after a few hours in. Minor nitpicks. But back to reminiscing, Final Fantasy does come off as daunting. The open-endedness of its design is both its blessing and a curse. Many story-driven RPGs with a similar concept, like Golden Sun or The Legend of Zelda, do guide the player's hand in showing them where to go when it comes to the world map, with subtle visual cues or having a party member saying, "We can't go this way yet." But Final Fantasy doesn't do that, and that's why it feels like such an adventure to play. So with my gushing in mind, I'll have to place the first entry in the series right here. Hopefully you're comfy there. You'll be sitting at the top for quite a while. And that's the first of many reviews on my Final Fantasy Retrospective series. Sorry this video took so long to get out the door. If you made it this far, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment of your favorite Final Fantasy and why. It might be featured in one of my future videos. As for what's coming next, I hope this steaming pile of disappointment won't take long to finish. Please look forward to my review on Final Fantasy II soon.